Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and this morning I'd like to do a little bonus video. Um, I'm doing this outside of my usual Thursday release sequence, and I'm not going to monetize it, so you should get it completely ad free. Because this is just really some musing of mine. I want to talk about the Norman Conquest. I like to share some of my thoughts on it. A lot of experts have called this the last Viking raid, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I just want to give you some of my impressions about the Norman Conquest. And I actually filmed this as part of another video. It was one on the evolution of arming swords in the Middle Ages that you'll be seeing pretty soon. But as I went through the footage, I thought, well, this is a pretty long piece with no real swords in it. Uh, and it probably deserves its own treatment instead of trying to cram it into another big video. So I thought I'd just break it out and just share it with you. And this is pure history nerd stuff, right? So if you love history, this is for you. It's not particularly about guns or weapons. It's this just about the past. Now, like I said, the Middle Ages took up nearly 1,000 years of time. And obviously, the culture, material culture, the intellectual culture, all sorts of things are going to change over that 1,000 years. I mean, just think, as I record this, it's the year 2021. Think about going back to the year 1000 and how different that was from today. I mean, it's an entirely different world. And the year 500 was an entirely different world from the year 1500. So that's why historians tend to break up the Middle Ages into more meaningful segments. And typically that's the early Middle Ages, which is from the fall of the Roman Empire, roughly 500 AD, until 1000 AD. And of course that encompasses its own different segments. You've got what's known as the migration era, which really started during antiquity, during the Roman Empire. You have the Carolingian Empire, the rise of the Carolingians, from Charles Martel through Charlemagne. And then you've got the Viking Age, which take up about the last 200 years of the early Middle Ages. And that whole time period is usually called the Dark Ages. And for good reason, I think. But around the year 1000, things really start to change. And that's why the year 1000 to the year 1300 are generally grouped together as the High Middle Ages. And of course, some people would put that out, they'll start at 1066 AD and they'll push it out to the 1340s with the advent of the Black Death, which, of course, really changed society and really did usher in, to a large extent, the later Middle Ages, which would take us up to roughly 1500 and the Renaissance. So the High Middle Ages, from 1000 or from 1066 up until 1300, that was the era of the true flowering of medieval society. You've ended the migration period, the Viking threat is finally ended. In fact, a lot of people consider the last Viking raid to have occurred in 1066, which would be William the Conqueror's conquest of England. And there's a lot of truth to be said for breaking it off there. I mean, you might say, well, the Normans are not really Vikings. Well, okay. They're descended from Vikings only, maybe like 3 generations before. But there was a lot more going on in 1066. What a lot of people don't realize is this was kind of a 3-legged stool, right? You had Harold Godwinson, and he was the elected king of England after the death of Edward the Confessor. And of course, his claim to the throne was tenuous. It was more based on being the firstest with the mostest, because he was the most powerful earl in England. Then you've got William the Conqueror, William the bastard Duke of Normandy, who of course will be the eventual winner. And he had a claim really probably the best claim to the throne. He was promised it by Edward, so they say. Harold, when he was a guest, by guest you should read hostage, of William, repudiated his claim and swore an oath, swore an oath to back William for king, which of course he totally chucked aside when Edward died, as happens so often. And then we've got the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, who also had a claim to the throne of England and who also invaded. And some people don't realize how much was going on in 1066. Three guys, Duke William of Normandy, Harold Godwinson of England, Harald Hardrada of Norway, all of them had at least 50% Viking blood, including Harold Godwinson, who was half Danish. So, no matter who won, the Norse were going to be the winners. And of course, what happened is Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, and by the way, he was no piker. I mean, Harald Hardrada was probably the most cosmopolitan man in that fight. He had left Norway when he was 15, basically exiled. His family lost the throne. He went a Viking in the rivers of Russia, where he was very active. And eventually he made his way down to Byzantium and became a member of the Varangian Guard. And the Varangian Guard in the Byzantine Empire was a lot like the Praetorian Guard in the Roman Empire, right? They were crack troops who provided the bodyguards for the emperor and who had a lot of internal power in the empire. But they also campaigned as among the best infantry that the Byzantine Empire had. And Harald Hardrada worked his way up to becoming the general of the Varangian Guard. And he lived in the most cosmopolitan city in the world of its time, or at least this side of China. And eventually he left Byzantium because the politics got a little too dangerous for him, went back to Norway and won the throne. So this was not some hayseed rube from the far northern edges of civilization. I mean, this was a guy who had seen the elephant, done it all, and probably the most sophisticated troop commander of the three participants. And his joining the fray had a huge impact on how England eventually ended up, because Harold invaded England from the north, Harald Hardrada, and he hit outside of York. He defeated two northern English earls and their armies, but Harold Godwinson, who was an excellent general, force-marched his way up to York, fought a battle at Stamford Bridge when Harald Hardrada's men were still flushed with victory from beating the local armies of the earls. And Harold Godwinson won an overwhelming victory and killed Harald Hardrada, and also killed his snake of a half-brother Tostig, who's the one who got Harald Hardrada to invade in the first place. A huge, huge win for Harold Godwinson. And a win that probably would have cemented his crown if it wasn't for the fact that after waiting months for the weather to turn, a favorable breeze came up, and William of Normandy sailed across the channel and landed on the English coast by Pensivie and began raiding the heck out of the coast and preparing to march on London. So Harold Godwinson is in York. He's got to turn around, march the entire length of the country with his professional soldiers, the housecarls, gather up a new army on his way there, a local army, because he had to release the northern guys, and fight a major battle with no rest, just fighting, which he did. And he fought a heck of a battle. and he very nearly won the Battle of Hastings. But William fought a good battle as well, and it could have gone either way for a while. But Harold was shot with an arrow in the eye, according to some stories. According to other stories, he was surrounded by Normans fighting with his housecarls, and he was hacked to death. Either way, Harold Godwinson, dead as a doornail. William of Normandy was in a position to have himself elected King of England. And the English kingship was not a hereditary kingship per se. It was an elective kingship. And even though William was taking the island by right of conquest, to be a legitimate king, he had to be elected not by the populace, because who cares what they thought, right? I mean, this was the Middle Ages. But he had to be elected by the other magnates of the kingdom, which he was, after replacing half of them. And by doing that, he took England out of the Norse sphere, where it was really orbiting, and brought it into the French sphere, which is where it remained, and where it remains to this day. The English probably don't want to hear that, but basically brought it into Western Europe as opposed to Northern Europe, with massive implications for the rest of history. And believe me, it could have gone any of the three ways. That's how close run it was. So that was the last Viking raid. You know, the Battle of Hastings, the entire Norman Conquest of England, is one of those points in history that causes people to say, well, what if? Because really so many things could have gone either way. I mean, Harold Hardrada could have won at Stamford Bridge, and what would things have been like then? Or Harold Godwinson could have won at Hastings. I mean, it was a near-run thing. He almost did. And what would history have been like then? But, you know, one possibility that I rarely see considered, that I find the most intriguing, is what if Harold Godwinson had honored his oath to William of Normandy? And what if he had supported William for the kingship of England? What would have happened then? And I think that's the most fascinating question, because if William had become king through the support of Harold Godwinson, there would have been no conquest of England. It wouldn't have been necessary. Right? So you wouldn't have had the entire English aristocracy wiped out, which is exactly what happened. You wouldn't have had all the land in England appropriated by the king, by William, and then passed out to his tenants-in-chief, making England the most feudal country in Western Europe. Much more so than France or Germany, where people still had individually owned holdings, not just peasants but noblemen known as allods. That didn't exist in England, or virtually non-existent, because William appropriated the entire land of England for himself. But if Harold had supported him for king, and William had come in through the normal, you know, elected process by the Witan, well, he would not have been able to rule like that. And he probably would not have wanted to, because, you know, his main desire was to get the resources of England. England was a very rich agricultural country. Get his hands on that money and be able to use it for his continental aspirations, which is pretty much what the English kings did anyway, but they did it by totally devastating English society. You know, the entire harrying of the North that happened under William the Conqueror, which virtually depopulated parts of northern England for 3 generations. None of that would have happened. And Harold Godwinson, of course, would have still been the premier aristocrat of England. He would have retained a tremendous amount of power. And there's almost no doubt that if he had kept his word and supported William, that he would have been regent in England while William dealt with his affairs on the continent, which he probably would have spent most of his time doing. Right? So going forward, that would have meant that you wouldn't have had all of the Anglo-Norman institutions that grew up in the Middle Ages. You would have had a continuation of Anglo-Saxon culture as it was around the year 1000. And however that would have evolved would have been quite different from the way English culture evolved under the Norman and Angevin kings. So that's the thing that I find most fascinating as far as a what if on the Norman Conquest of England. And, I often wonder what history would have looked like. I mean, there's a wonderful chance that we wouldn't be here in North America the way we are now. Doesn't mean it would not have been discovered by Europeans and colonized by Europeans. But, what if the English had the same role as the Swedish or the Norwegians in colonizing America, which is next to nothing, and we had left the entire continent open largely to the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French? How different would it have looked than it looks now? How different would all of history have been if Harold had just decided, you know what, I think maybe I ought to just support William for king. And his decision not to really led to the world we have today, which I find that kind of fascinating. So that's my history nerd talk for the week. I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, this is not something I'm going to do all the time, but every now and then, if something occurs to me that I want to share, I hope that you'll be open to hearing it, those of you who are interested in that, even if that's just a small minority of you. So if you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. Always helps us with the algorithm. If you're interested in historical weapons, which is my main subject, mostly 18th and 19th century firearms, but little medieval edge weapons as well. Well, by all means, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of that stuff. I'd love to have you here. And you'll see my next video on Thursday, and every Thursday after that. So until then, bye.